Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Lerner. I'm the chair of the Nemer Lecture Committee. I'm also a professor of history here at USC and director of the Max Kade Institute for Austrian, German, Swiss Studies at USC. And on behalf of the USC Kasdan Institute and the USC Visual Studies Research Institute, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 37th Annual Jerome Nemer Lecture. This year, we're delighted to welcome Deborah Dash Moore, and as a respondent, Bill Aaron, and in a few moments, I will speak in more detail about the two of them. Steve Ross, the director of the USC Kasdan Institute, is regrettably unable to join us tonight, but he extends his warmest welcome to all of you and his gratitude to our speakers for sharing their insights with us all tonight at the annual Jerome Nemer Lecture. And he and I also wish to thank Nancy Lutkehaus and her colleagues at the USC Visual Studies Research Institute for partnering with the Kasdan Institute to produce tonight's event. The USC Kasdan Institute takes great pride in its endowed annual lectures, which, like today's Nemer lecture, cover a range of topics from Jewish political life to Jewish scholarly and artistic contributions across America. The newest series, now in its third year, titled Kasdan Conversations, aims to bring together students, faculty, and the community at large for more informal and engaging discussions that explore and illuminate a wide variety of contemporary topics that are at the forefront of American Jewish culture and identity. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to join the Kasdan Institute mailing list in the lobby in order to be updated on all of the exciting events and partnerships that the Institute is pleased to offer this year. So at this time, without further delay, let me turn to our speakers. It's really a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, Professor Deborah Dash Moore, someone whose work I've admired for a number of years, but who I'd never had the chance to meet until just a few minutes ago. She's an extremely distinguished scholar of American Jewish history. Indeed, one I think I would say, as someone who's not actually in the field, really one of the creators of the field of American Jewish studies, who has written extensively on urban history, gender, World War II, and most recently, photography and visual culture in the American and American Jewish pasts. Since 2005, she's been the Frederick G.L. Hutwell Professor of History at the University of Michigan, where she directed the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, one of the preeminent Jewish studies institutes in the country. Before arriving at Michigan, she taught at Vassar College, and she's also taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Bard College, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, among other places. She's received numerous awards and honors, alas, far too many to list here, so I'll just name a few. The Lee Max Friedman Medal for Distinguished Service in the Field of American Jewish History in 2012, the Distinguished Humanist Award from Ohio State University in 2007, and in 2013, a Jewish Cultural Achievement Award from the Foundation for Jewish Culture. Deborah Dash Moore has written and edited a total of 13 books, along with dozens of scholarly articles, essays, and book chapters, and some non-scholarly interventions in the, as a public intellectual, I should also add. Let me just mention several of what I see as among her many major contributions. Her 1994 book, To the Golden Cities, Pursuing the American Jewish Dream in Miami and Los Angeles, redressed the traditional emphasis in American Jewish studies on New York and the Eastern urban experience with careful and deep research on Jewish migration to Florida and California after the Second World War. Indeed, in these sunny destinations, the Jewish newcomers were largely free of the constraints of established Jewish communal life and pursued economic opportunities and dreams of personal fulfillment that can fruitfully be compared to the American dream that lured their parents and grandparents from Eastern Europe. The book was, in many ways, foundational for the academic study of Los Angeles Jewish history. Her 2004 book, G.I. Jews, How World War II Changed a Generation, winner of the Samuel Wiener Prize for the best book in American Jewish history, returned to a theme that appears in many different instances throughout Deborah Dash Moore's work, the transformative impact of World War II on American Jewish identities and experiences, presenting the life stories of several members of the so-called greatest generation amid the sweeping changes in Jewish and American life in the middle of the 20th century. Challenging the often assumed notion of Jewish assimilation in these years, she shows how their war experiences made members of this generation simultaneously more American and more Jewish. In recent years, at least since her 2001 co-authored book, Cityscapes, A History of New York in Images, Deborah Moore has turned increasing attention to the study of documentary photography, leading the Liberating Lens Project, which reveals the centrality of American Jewish photographers in shaping views of the 20th century world. Her talk this evening, Jewish Photographers of Modernity, draws from these and other projects on Jews, photography, and American visual culture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deborah Moore.
So thank you, Paul. That was a really wonderful introduction, a very generous one. And it's great to be here and to be speaking. And I think that I'm going to ask for the lights to be dimmed so that you can look at some of the pictures better, please, because we've got a lot of very bright light on at the moment. So while they're dimming the lights, I want to start with a short poem by the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. He writes, "The Jews are like photos in a display window, all of them together, short and tall, alive and dead, brides and grooms, bar mitzvah boy and babies. Some are restored from old yellow photographs. Sometimes people come and break the windows and burn the pictures. And then they start photographing and developing all over again and display them again, sad and smiling." It's a poem in many ways to take you into thinking about photographs, although in fact, I'm not going to be showing you any photographs particularly about Jews. I'm going to be showing you photographs rather that were taken by Jewish photographers. And to let you get a sense of how they saw the world at that time. So as an introduction, the 20th century, in the 20th century, photography appealed to Jews for many reasons. It was a rapidly changing technology, and it offered them a livelihood with relatively modest capital investment. By the 1920s throughout Europe, from small towns in Poland to large cities in Germany, Austria, and France, Jews could be found running photography studios. So can you see, or should we dim the lights a bit more? Dim them more, that's what I thought, yeah. Yeah, can we do that? Maybe this really bright one on me? Is that better? Okay, good. So photography also attracted Jews because few barriers existed to studying the craft and entering the field. Although a handful of schools emerged in the years prior to World War II, many Jews learned how to take photographs through apprenticeship, experimentation, and practice. As the uses of photography expanded beyond portraits to journalism, documentary, sports, fashion, advertising, architecture, ethnography, and creative or artistic photography, photographers increasingly used one form of photographic practice, such as fashion, to pay the bills, freeing them to pursue a more personal photographic practice, such as documentary. Conversely, some visual artists used photographs as adjuncts to sketches, capturing fleeting aspects of a scene to be further developed at another time. But in all of these cases, photography occupied a kind of middle ground, located somewhere between a pragmatic technical skill and an expressive form of vision. This afternoon, I'd like to share with you some thoughts about another multifaceted aspect of photography, its liberating power for Jews, and how that came to shape some of the ways we see the modern world. Specifically, I want to look at a number of Jewish American photographers touched by what I'm calling the liberating lens. As I use this term, the liberating lens refers to the capability of photography to transform vision and concomitantly people's ability to act upon the world. These capabilities apply to photographers and their audiences. Jewish photographers have sometimes attributed to their photographs a kind of transcendence embedded in the moment captured. like life forms, as it were, preserved from 200-million-year-old amber, some believe photos can capture an instant that carries scientific, historical, or even religious weight. Images can change the people who see them. The liberating lens also refers to the camera's instrumental ability to free photographers from the constraints of life's circumstances. For some Jews, becoming photographers provided a path into modernity and identities less circumscribed by ethnic or religious boundaries. The camera liberated them to picture their own world. Their photographs gave them personal and collective experience and authority otherwise beyond their reach. As photographers, they interacted with a wide range of people, choosing, to borrow a reportorial formula, who, what, when, where, and how to photograph. Through the lens, they developed their perceptions of others and expressed their self-perceptions. Most of these Jewish American photographers wrote their own shooting scripts, though the most financially successful ones also took assignments. Their cameras empowered them to go out and bring back slices of the world, to select and prepare the best, and show them off to a wider audience, to people who may be surprised, appalled, educated, pleased, or enraged by their encounters. This notion of the liberating lens thus alludes to its potential influence on individual lives. Photography opened an avenue for poor teenagers to escape from cramped apartments, gave women a license to stare even out on gendered streets, and offered aspiring young artists a tool for expression. So let's begin with one of the icons of American photography with which I'm sure you're all familiar. The 1907 photograph by Alfred Stieglitz called the Steerage. This photograph, shot on a ship outward bound toward Europe, has come to exemplify the saga of mass immigration into the United States. Jews especially have seen it as picturing a liminal moment of the modern world. Taken during a peak year of immigration, when over 148,000 Jews entered the U.S., most of them through Ellis Island, the photograph appears to convey the traumas of the transatlantic journey. The picture captures a crowded upper deck of a ship filled with men and women who are traveling second class, and a slightly less crowded lower deck where women predominate. In the middle, a chain-link gangplank forms a kind of bridge. On the right, steps head down from one deck to the other, while on the left, a smokestack slants upward in a reverse angle from the steps. Our glance may gravitate to one man's round, black-banded, white straw hat, and then follow his gaze down to the deck below. There, a white shawl with 2 black stripes holds our attention. Women, their heads covered with scarves, cradle babies in their arms, while children loll around in restricted quarters. Stieglitz's image invites us to imagine an epic unfolding before our eyes. Despite its straight style and geometry of shapes, it shows us the setting of a classic tale of transit from one world to another, the passengers unaware of what waits them on their arrival. To better appreciate the steerage as a liberating vision, we need to view some pictures Stieglitz took prior to 1907, such as the terminal and the hand of man. Both present images of the modern world that reflect his goal to transform photography into an art form. Both photos use smoke and steam to evoke a sense of the city as a great living, pulsating thing. The terminal makes palpable the cold, bitter air surrounding the horse. The billowing black smoke of the train signals strength and power. In this context, how did Stieglitz come to take the steerage? And what did he make of it then and later? And to what extent has his own understanding of its importance shaped the subsequent career of this image? In 1907, Stieglitz, American-born son of prosperous German Jewish immigrants, married and a gentleman of leisure, took a trip to Europe aboard the Kaiser Wilhelm II. Although born in Hoboken in 1964 and educated as a child in New York City, Stieglitz was no stranger to Europe. He traveled there frequently. He had studied photochemistry in Germany in the 1880s. Of his first camera, which he bought in Berlin in 1883, he wrote, "It fascinated me, first as a passion, then as an obsession." Having grown up in a secularizing household, Stieglitz found religion in photography. "The camera was waiting for me by predestination," he proclaimed, "and I took to it as a musician takes to a piano or a painter to canvas. I found I was master of the elements, that I could work miracles, that I could do things which never before had been done." When Stieglitz returned in 1890 to New York City from his years in Western Europe, he came as a man on a mission. Shocked at the low regard for photography as merely a popular hobby akin to bicycling, he determined to change Americans' attitudes. Over the course of several decades, Stieglitz worked to establish a photographic scene in New York, in which photography was promoted as an art endowed with spiritual dimensions. Both his gallery and journal, though relatively short-lived, exerted exceptional influence in establishing frameworks for viewing and discussing photographs. Serious photography was nurtured through small gallery exhibition, fine art publications, and eventually museum acquisition. All this was a far cry from Eastman Kodak's slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest," that accompanied its introduction of the box camera in 1888. Stieglitz developed a credo. "I was born in Hoboken. I am an American. Photography is my passion, the search for truth, my obsession." He stood at the center of a movement which sought to produce a new American art and culture, a movement openly critical of the aggressive commercialism, hypocritical moralism, and empty conventionality of the reigning culture. For Stieglitz, arriving masses of impoverished immigrants, including 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe to work in factories, were themselves just another tributary of crass, commercial American life. Their plight did not particularly move him, an attitude common among other American-born and well-established children of a prior, largely Central European Jewish immigrant wave. But on this trip across the Atlantic, Stieglitz found the Nouveau Riche company in the first-class cabins boring. So he wandered off to look over a railing at the Steerage class passengers. There, writes photo historian Joel Smith, he experienced a new kind of epiphany. Stieglitz describes how he saw in the scene, and I quote, "a picture of shapes, and underlying it, a new vision that held me." Smith suggests that after that photograph, which Stieglitz subsequently named the Steerage, the photographer's real subject would be what he called the living moment. Stieglitz needed to rush back to the stateroom for his camera, which had only one plate left. He knew that if anyone moved, the picture I saw would no longer exist. As Smith points out, Stieglitz used these literally fabulous features in his narrative, A Hero's Lone Quest, the retrieval of the charmed implement, the exhaustion of all resources, in order to compress all the story's drama into the single act of exposing the negative. Stieglitz took the photograph in 1907, but he didn't actually print and display it until 1911. Then it came to represent for him a new way of seeing. Despite his evident distance from his foreign subjects and a perspective that looked down upon them, Stieglitz's photograph captivates viewers. The social extremes evident in the picture were the trigger, not the goal, of his pictorial exploration. Stieglitz sought not to penetrate, but to aestheticize the world by means of photography. The complex play of shapes, of hats and laundry, of angled stairs and smokestack, boldly anticipated what came to be called the new objectivity in photography. The Steerage was a straight photograph, by a master of dreamy pictorialism. In fact, Stieglitz later used this photograph to foreshadow his own eventual escape from his family and from his leisure class identity. He embedded a personal story of liberation in the image of the men and women in transit from one world to another. Today, when the steerage is reproduced, as it often is, it invites identification by American Jews of the passengers as Jews. Although Stieglitz's photograph actually portrays stories of failed immigration, since the men and women and children are returning to Europe, right? His skilled pictorial narrative allows us to perceive Jewish immigrants, even to identify passengers as religious Jews, by misreading the woman's shawl with its 2 black stripes as a tallis, a prayer shawl, worn only by men at that time. We imagine that the men and women on the lower deck are escaping from Europe and about to enter America, rather than leaving the United States, either because they have been denied admission or as part of a return migration. Stieglitz's renown as a photographer, his importance in shaping American photography in the early decades of the 20th century, his acknowledged Jewish identity, and the photograph's title, as well as its evidence power and popularity, conspired to ensconce the image as an iconic record of Jewish immigration. As American Jews understand it, emigration from Europe liberated them from oppression and poverty. The fiery trajectories of Robert Capa's life and photographic fame seem to be a world away from the controlled path paved by Stieglitz. And yet, Jewish stories bind them together. Capa is renowned as the greatest of war photographers. He ascribed religious meaning to images of war that seem to contradict his narrative. Born Andre Friedman in Hungary, initially he headed to Berlin to write, but ended up learning photography. One of his early photographs from 1932 shows Leon Trotsky exiled from Russia and speaking in Copenhagen on the meaning of the revolution. Trotsky, a Bolshevik and a Jew, fled the Nazis and Stalin, who eventually had Trotsky murdered in Mexico. Friedman fled from Berlin to Paris, where he reinvented himself with the help of Gerda Taro as an American photojournalist, Robert Capa. His photographs of the Spanish Civil War, along with Taro's and fellow Jewish photojournalist David Seymour, known as Shim, helped to convey the human costs of that conflict in the minds of many Europeans. All 3 pictured war from the anti-fascist Republican point of view. In 1939, Capa escaped from Europe, settling in New York City. Classified as an enemy alien by the US government, he nonetheless sought to return to Europe to cover the war. His surviving 11 photographs of D-Day changed how we visualize war. But when Capa described his decision to accompany the first wave of American GIs landing on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, he framed his account in the context of Jewish liberation. Once a year, usually sometime in April, he wrote, every self-respecting Jewish family celebrates Passover, the Jewish Thanksgiving. At a crucial moment in the proceedings, the youngest of the sons, I have been doing it for years, he claimed, steps up and addresses his father in solemn Hebrew. He asks, what makes this day different from all other days? Then the father, with great relish and gusto, tells the story of how many thousands of years ago in Egypt, the angel of destruction passed over the firstborn sons of the chosen people, and how afterwards General Moses led them across the Red Sea without getting their feet wet. On D-Day, Capa got his feet wet. The angel of destruction brought death to many American GIs. Capa thought the story of crossing the Channel and landing on the beaches at Normandy deserved a similar annual recounting. This is how he described his choices as a civilian enemy alien photographer. The USS Chase was a mothership which carried many assault barges, which it would release 10 miles off the French coast. I would have to make up my mind and choose a barge to ride in. On the one hand, the objectives of Company B looked interesting, and to go along with them seemed a pretty safe bet. Then again, I used to know Company E very well. I was about to choose between Companies B and E when Colonel Taylor, commander of the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division, the attacking force, tipped me off that regimental headquarters would follow close behind the first waves of infantry. If I went with him, I wouldn't miss the action, and I'd be a little safer. If at this point my son should interrupt me and ask, what is the difference between the war correspondent and any other man in uniform? I would say that the war correspondent gets more drinks, more girls, better pay, and greater freedom than the soldier. But having the freedom to choose his spot and being allowed to be a coward and not be executed for it is his torture. The war correspondent has his stake, his life, in his own hands. And he could put it on this horse or that horse, or he can put it back in his pocket at the very last minute. I am a gambler. I decided to go in with Company E in the first wave. To this day, Kappa's photos sear our sensibilities. This is how we visualize D-Day. His hands were shaking with fear. In fact, after making it to the Easy Red section of the beach, Kappa retreated to another barge with medics. After he made it back onto the USS Chase, he chose not to return to France. The only other war correspondent in the invasion never even made it off the ship. Kappa's photographs, hastily developed by a too-excited technician, were mostly ruined. But those that survived showed a blurry, gritty movement of men wading as in a crazed, slow-motion nightmare through the water. This dizzying, grim portrait of modern warfare would stay with people. Kappa enshrined the epic battle of D-Day through his iconic photographs, epitomized perhaps by this single image, it's image of a single soldier forging with desperate resolve through rough waves, eyes fixed on the beach ahead. These smeary visions would eventually contribute to new ways of portraying motion and conveying emotion. For Kappa, however, the camera literally became his passport, liberating him to choose where he would cast his lot. He opted to accompany the men of Company E because he knew and trusted them. In his mind, these men were reenacting the Exodus, although they were not fleeing slavery, but invading Europe, fighting to overcome the Pharaoh of the modern world. Kappa's photographs of World War II gave viewers a sense of the sequence of events. Although each image conveys the confusion of the moment, the pictures gain additional force when seen as part of a sequence. The hallucinatory reality of combat time characterizes a number of Kappa's photos. And Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan's opening sequence, if you've seen that, animates some of Kappa's photos of D-Day. Later in the movie, Spielberg also used another sequence of images by Kappa, Death of an American Soldier. These 4 photos move from an initial horizontal shot that pictures the soldier sprawled in an open doorway of a balcony, spent bullets scattered beneath him, to a second vertical photo taken a few seconds later that portrays his blood pooling beside him and shows bare branches of trees outside. Kappa followed these with 2 additional photographs. The third image captures another soldier crawling toward his fallen comrade, glancing back at the photographer and, as we realize in the 4th photo, fellow soldiers. He is going to take the fallen soldier's place at the machine gun on the balcony. This last photo also shows the room with the balcony, the open window, the ornate glass-paneled curved wooden bookcase, the desk with its lamp, the frayed oriental rug on hardwood floors. The room had been someone's study before it became a site of urban warfare. Walter Rosenblum also hit Omaha Beach, albeit as a member of the U.S. Signal Corps. His photograph of a medic portrays another dimension of the invasion. Rosenblum discovered the camera's liberating power as a teenager before the war when he joined the New York Photo League in 1938. He found his way to the League because he needed a darkroom. He grew up on the streets of the Lower East Side and lived its poverty in a 3-room cold-water flat in an environment of religious orthodoxy, economic instability, and familial love. The League, established in 1936, brought Rosenblum into a setting both Jewish and American, deeply engaged with left-wing politics, and profoundly committed to photography as a progressive practice. Rosenblum became active, editing the League newsletter, Photo Notes, until he entered military service. The Photo League was dedicated to education and socially engaged photography. Along with other League members, he rejected bourgeois practices, nude, landscape, and still life photography. Photographers at the League organized themselves thematically into feature groups to represent the everyday life of poor and unemployed people, both mirroring them back to themselves and revealing their lives outward to the larger world. Rosenblum joined one of the feature groups, teaming up with others to photograph Pitt Street, eager to change the world by documenting the lives of ordinary working people and making their experiences accessible to all Americans. As he said somewhat defensively about his fellow photographers at the League, who were also taking pictures of the Lower East Side and other gritty urban neighborhoods, "We're not tourists spying on the quaint mannerisms of the people." Commerce didn't interest them, as it had attracted outsiders fascinated with the pushcart markets. Nor did they make yet more photos of the city's impressive buildings and elegant bridges. Instead, the Jewish photographers connected with the Photo League encouraged both photographers and their audiences to understand the city by looking at one another, its people, mostly at eye level. They picture New Yorkers on the city's streets engaged in looking, which is, of course, what one does on the streets. I want to consider a few photographs that have not become iconic, but which let us see another dimension of the liberating lens. During the difficult years of the Depression, cameras pulled poor Jews out of their homes where poverty imprisoned them. Photography opened a window for self-expression. For example, when Sid Grossman or Walter Rosenblum looked with a camera's lens, they saw a chance to picture ordinary people and in the process to express their political viewpoint. Such people, the people, mattered. Young Jewish photographers associated with the New York Photo League found themselves tuning into the self-organizing visual structure of street life, a geometry that is constantly being remapped through a shifting matrix of sightlines and body language. In Rosenblum's photo of 4 women sitting, standing, and watching children, we see a mundane scene set against a backdrop of chain-link fence and white underwear hanging out to dry in the summer sun. One woman links her fingers in the fence, her arm outstretched as she turns away from the baby carriage to watch something happening down the block. Another woman rests her bare arm on the carriage in a protective gesture. An older woman stands still while a younger woman wearing sunglasses, dark socks, and white shoes engages the child. This gendered street scene, taken on the Lower East Side, complements another Rosenblum photo of Chick's candy store. Here, we see men and boys hanging out, listening to a portly, well-dressed man vigorously making a point. He is sufficiently engaging to hold the attention of an audience of 6. Their relaxed posture suggests that they have been listening for a while. Inside the store, a man sits by the window, holding the door open. On the photo's edges, we can see 2 apparently unengaged figures. A boy on the right appears to be balancing on a cellar entrance, and a woman stoically sits in a tenement doorway, facing away from the men. Both photos portray a gendered world of flexibly divided streets. Slightly older than Rosenblum, Sid Grossman had been a founder of the New York Photo League when he was in his early 20s. After military service in Panama with the 6th Army Air Corps Public Relations Department, Grossman returned home with a new sense of the camera's personal, expressive possibilities. Prior to the war, his pictures documented poverty and dignity among New Yorkers, his own milieu. They reflected his communist commitments. After the war, he gravitated instead to those moments of public performance and display that he had photographed in Panama. His pictures of the Italian San Gennaro Street Festival capture the allure of looks in a milieu pervaded by a powerful mix of holy and profane. In this photograph, taken on Mulberry Street in the heart of Little Italy, Grossman portrays looks circulating among two women and a man, backlit by the bright lights of Ferrara's pasticceria, whose offering of gelato can just be glimpsed through the plate glass. The women are wearing flowered dresses and dainty hats. One holds a small flower in her hand. They are grinning at a young man who has wrapped his arm around himself, holding on to his right shoulder, a gesture of self-containment. He, too, smiles at what appears to be a flirtatious gesture from the women. One senses here a ritual not only of address, as the sociologist Erving Goffman puts it, but also a staging of self-presentation. This picture of the San Gennaro Festival encapsulates its sensual power. The self is constituted at the festa, as the scholar Robert Orsi has argued, by a kind of religious kinetics in the full gaze of the community. Grossman's photograph depicts what Orsi calls the essential elements of comportment, the necessary gestures of the Italian-American self. In another shot, taken almost at the same moment, we can see that a man on the left has caught the photographer in the act. He reminds us that on the streets we all engage in looking for looks, avoiding looks. Grossman's Mulberry Street Festival photos give us a glimpse into the street's promiscuous moments, mixing sacred and profane, women and men together, light and dark, public and private. The eye-level humanism of Rosenblum's and Grossman's street photography rejected the architectural bias and romantic style that dominated urban photographic representations. Instead, their photographs demand a particular type of participatory viewing and invite narrative improvisation. Gary Winogrand hit the streets of Manhattan around the time of Sid Grossman's premature death in the early 1950s. Winogrand grew up Jewish in the Pelham Parkway section of the Bronx in an apartment so crowded that the only room where he could be alone was the bathroom. He walked the streets at night to escape this lack of privacy. Both of his parents worked in the garment industry, his father in leather, his mother sewing neckties. Winogrand graduated high school, served in the military, and studied painting on the GI Bill. Then he discovered the darkroom, open 24 hours a day at Columbia University. He switched to photography. I never looked back, he recalled. In 1949, he attended Alexei Brodovich's design laboratory at the New School for Social Research. The critic John Shakowsky claimed, at the time of Winogrand's entrance on the New York photo scene, one could make a beginning with little more than energy, confidence, and a distaste for regular working hours. The camera freed Winogrand from those social constraints of earning a middle-class living in the era of the organization man. By the mid-50s, he was doing assignments for Collier's and Sports Illustrated, and by 1960, he had his first exhibit at the Image Gallery. Winogrand gravitated to Midtown rather than working-class neighborhoods. He filled thousands of rolls of film that he had no time to develop, let alone print. Winogrand often used wide-angle lenses and shot rapidly. His Bronx upbringing made Manhattan not quite home. The writer Fran Lebowitz suggests that he retained a fascination with New York that manifests itself as a kind of wised-up curiosity. There was no agenda, no bottom line, just engagement. Let us look at two Winogrand photographs of street culture that bracket the 1960s. This first one, from 1961, taken on a street of Midtown Manhattan, shows 4 young men walking and talking. 3 of them dress in almost identical reversible coats. 2 wear the dark side out, 1 shows the light side. The 4th man, who is a bit stout, sports a raincoat. One guy with a cigarette seems to be speaking, his hands gesturing expressively. He throws only a sidelong glance at the woman passing to his left, although she has attracted the full passing attention of his 3 buddies. Indeed, the man closest to this expensively attired woman, mink stole, chic veiled hat, has locked in on her. His hands may be in the pockets of his coat, but his look devours her. The other man, with his right hand on his throat, looks quizzical, or perhaps in transition. Behind this foursome stretches a commercial street with signs for cameras, shoes, clothes, and food. The scene, apparently on 42nd Street, looks west toward Fifth Avenue and the New York Public Library. Winogrand's photo reminds us that looking at women is an integral part of male street behavior, especially in Midtown, where women walk the sidewalks with men. In this next photo from 1969, Winogrand shows us one young woman's modest interactions. Her plaid skirt and dark blazer suggest that she is a parochial school student. She is seated demurely, legs together, hands in her lap, holding a newspaper. Perched on a granite ledge removed from the passing crowd, she watches 3 men walk by. Winogrand's photo seems split in half by a dark glass high-rise facade and a white sidewalk. Against a background of looming buildings, a young man's white summer clothes emphasize the contrast. Winogrand catches not just the young woman's solitary mood, but also her interaction with the men. The sailor and the fellow in white both turn their heads slightly to observe her. The third man's eyes, the street filled with pedestrian. Winogrand's photo serves up another unique slice of street culture variations on a theme. Like Winogrand, Bruce Davidson made his living as a photographer. He grew up in a Chicago suburb in a single-parent household. His mother gave him his first camera as a kid, and he spent hours in the darkroom. After graduating Yale, he initially settled in a suburb north of New York, commuting daily to a job at Eastman Kodak Lab in Manhattan. But when Davidson started to take his own pictures, he gradually realized that the camera could be his ethnographic eye. With his camera, he could extend himself, getting to know people unlike himself. Davidson started with circus performers. Later, he focused on what was billed as the most dangerous street in New York, East 100th Street. However, I want to discuss pictures he took of a Brooklyn gang. In the spring of 1959, Davidson writes, I met a group of teenagers in Brooklyn that called themselves the Jokers. At the time, there were thousands of gang members in New York City. Davidson read a newspaper article about a skirmish in Prospect Park and decided to find the gang and enter the cool world of their lives. They were Catholic teenagers who had to go to Mass each Sunday. Davidson was in his mid-20s, a Jewish photographer with loose ties to Jewish culture and religion. His photograph, Joker in the Pack, seems to stage an urban drama of looking, reflectively and reflexively. A young woman glances in the mirror of a cigarette vending machine. She makes a show of combing her hair just because she can, and also maybe because Davidson's camera is looking on. The young man next to her, as if trying out for West Side Story, a smash hit on Broadway at the time, rolls a package of cigarettes into his T-shirt sleeve. Right on cue, a sign announces, no smoking in this area. Davidson catches on the wing a cool, already nostalgic show of posed attitude. Years later, an older surviving member of the Jokers, Benji, recalled, Beautiful Kathy. She was always sad, always fixing her hair. She killed herself with a shotgun. I want to conclude with two very different Jewish women photographers. Rebecca Lepke grew up like Rosenblum in a poor family on the Lower East Side. She purchased a camera in 1939 with money she made dancing in a troupe at the New York World's Fair. Nan Goldin grew up in the 1960s in Lexington, a middle-class suburb outside of Boston. She discovered photography as a teenager. For Lepke, the camera let her walk the streets of her neighborhood, hang out as boys and men did, and it gave her a license to stare. For Goldin, the camera facilitated an escape from her family and their bourgeois gendered assumptions. She also managed to piece together gradually an alternative family through her photographs. Both photographers let us see their worlds through women's eyes. Lepke discovered the Photo League in the 1940s and took its lessons to heart. Like other young Jewish women photographers, she trolled for pictures in public. She insistently inserted herself into the male-dominated street culture of ethnic neighborhoods. Female street photographers often exposed their intentions as they observed others, although they usually avoided direct exchanges with their subjects. Unavoidably, the tension of gendered attention was not an uncommon aspect of photographic interactions. A young working-class Jewish woman with an expensive camera around her neck walked a particularly delicate path along New York streets. Women did not normally assume their right to stare, but when they looked through a camera's lens, they became active participants in street rituals of looking. Lepke's portrait of a girl looking out an open window places her front and center. An older woman wearing an apron hovers in the background, observing the interaction of photographer and child. Clearly, Lepke has the girl's attention. She holds still for her portrait. She wears a striped dress. In her hair, neatly parted and pinned to the side, is a cloth flower. There is an eagerness in her gaze, an almost palpable sense of desire. Historian Susan Wasserman notes, the street and the neighborhood were very much about family. The Lower East Side, long an immigrant neighborhood where life was lived outdoors, attracted Lepke as a site both accessible and meaningful. She knew her way around the area and was familiar with its rhythms. Familiarity, as photo historian Max Kozloff observes regarding New York Jewish photographers, was both an asset that brought them unprecedentedly close to street behavior and, he points out, a form of knowledge with which to decode it. Nan Goldin also turned to portraiture of the familiar, in her case of herself and her friends. On occasion, she used mirrors to photograph herself. At other times, she activated the camera's shutter from a distance. Like Stieglitz, she admitted, "I make pictures out of obsession." But unlike him, she confessed, "Later, I give them some rational meaning." Armed with her camera, Goldin frequented hangouts of New York City's gays, transsexuals, and drug addicts. She usually presented her images to her friends in slideshows, which allowed her to experiment with image sequences. As for point of view, she writes, "I want the people in my pictures to stare back." Photography gave her tools both to make history and invent family. For Goldin, a photograph can document and trigger real memory. The image produces as well as reproduces her relationships. Rather disjointedly, Goldin remarks, "I grew up in a troubled family, and my parents, intellectual Jews, were all absent," as she put it. Watching sitcoms on television, she, quote, "saw nothing that represented what went on in my family, no record of real family life." When she started to take personal documentary photographs in the 1970s, she reflected that they were not considered valid as art. Everyone kept their family pictures in the closet. In a photograph Goldin dubbed "The Parents," she presents them unflatteringly. They have carefully coordinated their clothes with one another and with the couch they sit on. But her mother glances down. her father gazes off to the side. They decline, at least in the exposure Golden published, to stare back at their daughter's camera. And yet, compared with Golden's often brutal self-portraits, this photograph seems relatively less cruel. Over the course of the 20th century, Jewish American photographers went out and introduced themselves to the modern world. As they did so, they developed their camera's liberating potentials. On occasion, they told stories about the liberating lens, intersecting versions of personal and Jewish history. More often, they downplayed what the camera could do, take them into new worlds, serve as passport and protection, let them confront their own fears, and get a handle on the chaos of the streets. In New York, young Jewish men and women established their own clubhouse, the Photo League, where they came to learn and indeed to shape this new photographic trade, its technical requisites and its range of opportunities. Attitude was mandatory. Those who made progress worked their way inside ordinary moments to create images that have become powerful, if not iconic. Initially, they set out to change how people perceived New York City, itself an icon of 20th century urbanism. Within a decade, photos that portrayed the city as a machine-age monument to inhumanity looked dated, beside the point. Young photographers of the Photo League looked around how to explore, in fact, how they and their fellow citizens managed to deal with one another on a daily basis. It turned out that the built environment was the easy part of a shifting geometric world that urban dwellers constantly negotiate. It changes in slow motion. The city's streets and sidewalks, on the other hand, constitute networked stages on which dynamic human perceptions and intentions are negotiated on the fly. Here's where several generations of Jewish American photographers learned to manifest daily life among family, friends, and strangers. They expanded not only the subjects of portraiture, but also drew attention to the dynamism of looking itself. As urban photographers, these Jews created a new sort of interpersonal street photography and a different type of family album. Their pictures reveal a discomfort with strangers, along with a hidden dependency upon them. In choosing to photograph familiar strangers, these Jewish American photographers also accepted a measure of responsibility for them, a responsibility that helps us see what it means to account, day in and day out, for one's interactions. They opened our eyes to the ways in which each moment affords us freedom with discipline. Thank you.
Wow, my mind is reeling. There's so much, you presented so much fascinating material and so many very famous photographers and some unknown. Combining the deep historical analysis with reading the images, and I feel like this has given us an enormous amount of food for thought. But now, it's my pleasure to introduce our respondent, and I think we're extremely fortunate to have him here with us tonight. Bill Aaron, who is in some sense both an example of American Jewish photography and someone who's thought extensively about photography. Bill Aaron holds a PhD in sociology, and he first achieved prominence as a photographer from his role in documenting Jewish communities around the world, from here in Los Angeles to New York to Israel, and including Cuba and the former Soviet Union. This led to the publication of From the Corners of the Earth, which appeared with the Jewish Publication Society and featured an introduction by Chaim Potok. In Shalom Ya'al, he documented Jewish life in the American South. And then he went on in 2004 to produce Holocaust Survivors, The Indestructible Spirit, a collection of 100 portraits of survivors in the Southern California area. Among his many other projects include New Beginnings, Surviving Cancer Stories, about people living with cancer diagnosis. A prolific writer as well as photographer, Bill Aaron's works have been exhibited throughout the world. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Paul, for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank first of all, I'd like to thank the Nemer Lecture Committee, particularly Dr. Lerner, for inviting me to respond to someone whose work I have known for some time and have admired. I'd also like to thank Professor Moore for coming to Los Angeles and braving this beautiful weather. But mainly, I'd like to thank her for giving me new insight into my profession, the function of the tools that I use. In the interest of full disclosure, I'd like to state at the outset that while Professor Moore's thesis is from an academic point of view, my comments will be from the perspective of photography. You might say that we have the way two intersecting circles have a common ground. That is how I view our two respective fields. There we go. The green one, right? No? No? I'm pressing the wrong button. The right arrow. Thank you, Deborah. Okay. In the first half of the 20th technology, right? In the first half of the 20th century, Jewish photographers such as Alfred Stieglitz, whom Professor Moore mentioned, Paul Strand, Ben Shahn, Alfred Eisenstadt, Margaret Burke-White, Robert Capa, and Roman Vishdiak, among others, transformed photography from a novelty into a celebrated art form and a catalyst for social change. Through the lens, they defined what photography at its best could be while creating some of the most dramatic images in history. To explain the fact that so many Jews have played a major role in the development of American photography in the first half of the 20th century, most critics look to the content of their photographs to detect underlying issues and values, such as social change and social justice. Indeed, the credo of the Photo League, which provided such a formative experience for so many of the great photographers of the 1950s and 60s, reads in part, "Photography has tremendous social value. Upon photographers rests the responsibility and duty of recording the world as it is today." Paul Strand, a teacher in the Photo League, wrote, "It is one thing to photograph people. It is quite another thing to make others care about them by revealing the core of their humanness." Because 35mm cameras had become so sophisticated, the photographers of the 1950s and 60s were able to concentrate on the aesthetic concerns of their art while working. One of the best at this was Gary Winogrand, whom Professor Moore has rightly emphasized. His mastery of what had become known as the decisive moment, that is, the exact and unrepeatable instant when visual and emotional elements come together to express the meaning of the scene. His mastery of this decisive moment was so skillful that he became the only photographer to receive 3 one-man shows in New York at New York's Museum of Modern Art and a 4th posthumously. He once remarked, "The problem with photography is not how to make a pretty picture, but to find a way to transform the real world into something completely different, into a distinctive image. The photographer is responsible for only 2 things, what's in the frame and when you snap the shutter. The camera does the rest." Gary also famously remarked in the 1970s, "To be a great photographer, it is first of all necessary to be Jewish." Of course, he was talking about himself. Professor Moore has now given us a new orientation with which to look at this issue and a new articulation, namely that it was the liberating power of the camera that attracted these photographers in the first place. The camera enabled them to earn a living, to be a part of a wider circle of artists, to break away from the stylistic conventions of previous generations of artists, and to not be bound by ethnicity or religion, as Jews throughout history have been. It was not necessarily being Jewish, as Gary Winogrand and some critics would have us believe, but it was the empowering, and I would add, portability of the camera that offered so much opportunity. They were free to become what they aspired to be, and perhaps it was their Judaism that pointed them towards one subject or another. In this particular image, you can see Winogrand struggling not only with composition and the kinds of issues that Professor Moore alluded to, the relationship between the three elements of the photograph. The women walking in the center, one of them, possibly the other two, looking at the person in the wheelchair. And then on the right, the separate issue of the people on the park bench. But he's also strong. I mean, this would be his explanation of a decisive moment, that instant that is unrepeatable and exact. But he's also struggling with the issue of light. We all know that without light, you can't make a photograph. With light, light is something to be manipulated to make the photographs that much stronger, that much more dramatic. Georg Kraus is one of my favorite photographers, and I searched around for Jewish photographers for this response, and I didn't know if he was Jewish, so I called him up and I tentatively said, "I hope you don't mind if I ask, but are you Jewish?" And he said to me, "Funny you should ask." His mother was Jewish. As photography critic William Myers points out, these photographers wish to be invisible to themselves as Jews, or, at any rate, not to use their art to make their presence as Jews known to others. Naomi Rosenblum, a teacher, a photographer, and the author of A World History of Photography, has said, "We weren't Jews, we were leftists." Robert Frank. In historical terms, it was really the advent of Robert Frank's book, The Americans, in 1955 that heralded this post-Photo League generation of photographers. These artists were distinguished from their predecessors by a new attitude. That is, they looked at affluent society, and although they found it flawed, they concluded that it was not up to them to mend it. These photographers were bound by no mission except to see life clearly, not to reform it. Their motto became, "A photograph must be more interesting than the thing photographed in order for the subject to be clearly seen and understood." Artists commonly try to push against the boundaries of their art. Photographers of the 1950s and 60s had changed direction from those that came before them. What I'd like to mention and show a few examples of is another change in direction that a new generation of photographers of the 1970s and 80s began. Some Jewish photographers turned their cameras inward to explore their own Jewish identities. In Professor Moore's terms, they used their cameras reflexively. That is, their cameras enabled them to examine their own worlds. They acknowledged their Jewish heritage and turned their cameras inward towards their own lives. Religious or secular, they were interested in how the camera would depict their personal Judaism and Jewish experiences. They took their cameras everywhere, into their homes, their synagogues, their celebrations, and their travels. They internalized the aesthetic advancements of their predecessors, while their cameras freed them to go in a more introspective direction. One of the most accomplished of these photographers is Neil Folberg, who was a Baal Tshuva and a student of Ansel Adams. For his magnificent book entitled "And I Shall Dwell Among Them," he traveled for 4 years photographing synagogues all over the world. He writes, "When I began the project, I was overwhelmed with the scale of the task that lay before me. I faced a challenge. How would I photograph so many interior spaces and yet manage to see and capture the uniqueness and holiness of each? If these synagogues would have been photographed according to a formula and without passion, they would have lost the charm and life that had been infused into them by so many generations of Jews." Gay Block writes, "In 1986, Malka Drucker and I began interviewing and photographing Christians who had rescued Jews in Europe during the Holocaust. Through their stories, I came to realize that there were 4 roles that were played during the war. Some people were perpetrators, some were victims, some were rescuers, but most were bystanders. It is through my photography that I began to discover my own Jewish heritage." Joan Roth says, "While photographing the early feminist movement in the United States, I saw the need to photograph indigenous women worldwide to debunk the invisible roles of Jewish women in Africa, Yemen, India, and Eastern Europe, and to make them, once rendered invisible for centuries, visible." Okay. Lawrence and Aisha Saltzman. Cornel Kappa, who Professor Moore mentioned his brother, Robert Kappa. Cornel Kappa. Cornel was older, no? I defer. Cornel Kappa, the founding director of the International Center for Photography in Manhattan, wrote in his foreword to the Saltzman's book, The Last Jews of Radutz, that the book itself represents a modern miracle. This miracle, Kappa writes, is manifold. 1, how a handful of people managed to survive the Holocaust and straggle back to their homes in Radutz. 2, how 2 young people, the Saltzmans, dedicated their hearts, brains, and skill to fix and transmit that experience for us. And 3, how everybody involved, governments, foundations, and the people themselves, opened their doors so that now we can hold this special jewel of a vanishing life in our hands. Faced with a world which seemed to disbelieve that Jews migrated to rural areas of the West, Penny Wolin set out to discover the culture of a 140-year Jewish presence in the cowboy state of Wyoming. She says, "The camera is both a license to question and learn and a commitment to tell the story." She then adds, "I do not think there is a Jewish vision in photography, only a very strong Talmudic motivation." For myself, in the 1970s, the camera afforded me the opportunity to explore and discover the career that I wanted for myself, as well as my own place in Judaism, basically what kind of a Jew I wanted to be. I'd like to end by pointing out that at this time in history, other Jewish photographers turned their cameras inward towards other kinds of realities. The most intriguing of these photographers was Diane Arbus, born Diane Nemeroff, who featured her particular and peculiar brand of psychological reality. She was interested in marginalized people, dwarfs, giants, prostitutes, transgender people, nudists, circus performers, and others whose normality was perceived by the general populace as ugly or surreal. She wrote, "A photograph is a secret about a secret." Cindy Sherman, the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship in 1995, dressed herself up and photographed her fantasies of what she could become. Originally a painter, she abandoned that form and took up photography. There was nothing more to say through painting, she later recalled. I was meticulously copying other art, and then I realized I could just use a camera and put my time into the idea instead. Danny Lyon. He used his camera to conquer his fears of people on the fringe, including the Hells Angels and chain gangs in the South. Aaron Siskind photographed the beauty of the minutiae in our environment. He wrote that he began his foray into photography when he received a camera for a wedding gift and began taking pictures on his honeymoon. He quickly realized the artistic... Sorry. There we go. He quickly realized the art... I am... I don't... Okay, I'll go back a sentence. He wrote that he began his foray into photography when he received a camera for a wedding gift and began taking pictures on his honeymoon. He quickly realized the artistic potential that the camera offered. Thank you all very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Bill. I found that very moving and very, again, there's a lot to talk about. We have a little bit of time for questions for both speakers, so please raise your hand and someone will come around with a microphone for you. See any questions? Take a second to digest everything that we've just been listening to. Well, while we wait, I maybe have a question for Deborah. One issue that you didn't thematize here, but I know has played a role in your work elsewhere, is gender, and specifically so on the one hand, we have this extraordinary presence of Jews among kind of well-known photographers and in photography in general in the modern period in the US and in Europe. But within that group, women seem to be extraordinarily well represented, especially at a time when women didn't have access to many other careers and professions. And I wonder if you could just speak about women in photography and if there's something different going on between Jewish men and Jewish women, or kind of how you would see gender playing a role in the history of photography in the periods you've talked about.
Okay, that's a great question, and it's one that cuts across not just the U.S. but also European photography, because although I don't focus on European experience, there were Jewish women who went into especially portrait photography and had portrait studios in Berlin in the 20s and in Paris in the 30s and other parts of Europe. And in many cases, those portrait studios were also sort of like salons, you know, in that people hung out there, not just people who came to have their portraits taken, but there were artistic spaces. In the U.S., you don't have that as much. What you do have, however, are photographers. I showed some of them who are similar to the Photo League interests, right, in more political photography. But there are others like Esther Bubley, for example, whose work I didn't show, who get involved with what grew out of the FSA, what grew out of government-sponsored photography. So she enters sort of the photographic world in the United States in the 1940s and starts to take pictures of bus trips, right, that people, and she didn't drive, so she took pictures of bus trips, and you begin to get a lot of women who are going to take Eve Arnold and others who end up having significant careers in terms of photojournalism, and that's another whole area. And some of these women, of course, are going to be successful in photographing family life, in taking advantage of some of the opportunities that occur with these large format magazines that are become heavily illustrated, not just fashion magazines, but Ladies' Home Journal and other magazines, in addition to Life and Look and the general picture magazines. So photojournalism becomes an opportunity for women in the United States, and one whereby they too can earn a livelihood, which is, yes, I didn't go into, I was mostly just talking about the street interactions, but yeah.
Yes, Ruth. The microphone's coming, Ruth.
One of the things that's so stunning is the percentage of Jews who are photographers who are Jewish. And, there's historical reasons for this. So many professions were closed, and aspects of the art world, because of who was allowed to enter training academic institutions. And this, is even truer for women photographers. This is the opportunity to be an artist, whereas other things were closed. And I think it would be very interesting to compare some non-Jewish photographers and see whether the work indeed looks different, or some of the same kinds of forces of being an outsider, being in a profession that was influential but not respected so much, has an effect on their view, their worldview, and their view of other people.
So your comment is specifically about women outside photographers, or just in general?
First in general, but then
Okay.
both women and men.
So there's no question that in the space of a talk, it's hard to show a lot of outsiders, right? So I showed you a couple of Bernice Abbott photos, right? And Abbott was involved with the Photo League. She took very different kinds of pictures when she went to picture New York. She liked to take pictures in the early morning. She didn't like many people around. That was not how she was interested. She saw herself as working in the spirit of Lepke, the French photographer who also pictured Paris in the teens and the 20s. Well, he died in the mid-20s, so a little earlier. And that's one type of non-Jewish photographers. Then you have a lot of non-Jewish photographers who are involved with the FSA, the Farm Security Administration photographs. So Dorothea Lange is probably one that everybody knows. And Lange's photographs are shaped in part by the shooting scripts that she received from Roy Stryker. She was, being paid, right, to take pictures, and there were certain things that he wanted. And so what her own choices might have been is something colored by also what she had to produce for him. But there is in some of her photographs, I would say there are echoes of certain Christian imagery that you don't usually see in the Jewish women photographers. Although there's definitely the same effort to take a picture, as you mentioned, where we quoted that not just to take a picture, but to have the person care, right? The Paul Strand quote, to care about who it is who's being whose image you see. So there is crossover. Now, obviously, that's completely different from, what William Klein would say is, well, the Gentile photographers, they go out and take pictures of the woods. And Jews don't do that. But there is a large cluster of really wonderful nature photographers, very few of whom are Jewish. right? And most of them do like it. I mean, Ansel Adams, and Weston, etc. So there are some differences as well. I think it's most interesting where they overlap and how to think about what's happening. And partly, I would say that it also has to do with the circles that people are in, you know, especially in the period that I'm interested in. People didn't have their own dark rooms. They shared darkroom space. That meant when you're developing or printing film, you've got other people there to look at it, to comment. I mean, it's not an individual alone kind of process. So I think those things play into it as well.
If you could talk about Jewish photographers of today or the more recent past, and how it may differ from what you've showed us in terms of subject matter, in terms of composition, in terms of technology.
So one of the things, I mean, I don't come into today so much, where people are not using film anymore, right? And that's a major difference. And so when you can take a photograph, I mean, you were around taking pictures and you looked at what you took, right? So, you know, back in the day, you took a photograph and you didn't know exactly what you had until you actually developed it. So I've not gone into that new stage, right? I mean, I have stuck into the old stage where people used film and therefore couldn't see what they had taken a picture of until they actually developed it. So if you think about some of those photographers, Larry Sultan, I mean, who's LA, right, based, or Lauren Greenfield, I find that their work does wrestle with some of these questions that have to do with their own personal lives. I mean, with Greenfield, she goes back in fast forward to photograph the high school where she grew up, but she also pushes herself to go to South LA, South Central LA, where she had never gone as a kid growing up, and she wanted to see what it was like to be a teenager. And these are very different kinds of photographs. They're closer to the kinds of interactions that maybe a William Klein might have done, where people know that she's taking the picture and she's interacting with them, which isn't always true for some of the street photographers, right? Although you can tell that there's awareness, but not as much. Larry Sultan did some incredible photographs of his family, where he took the photographs that his father had taken of their family journey, of how he understood it, and photographed him and his mother as well at this point in their lives in the 1980s. It's called Pictures from Home, I think it's called, the series. And there, you know, the personal element is even more visible than with Nan Goldin, where she's creating an alternative family. He's dealing with his actual family. And there is, because this is a middle-class family, and it's LA, there's this sort of interpenetration of inside and outside space, of public-private. There are pictures where the clothes that the mother wears is coordinated with the color of the wall, you know, things like that you wouldn't see in a working class milieu. So I think that for these two photographers at least, you know, who I've actually spent some time looking at a lot of their work, the liberating piece is very important. You know, Sultan says when he goes back home to take pictures that he'd just become a father himself and he wanted to know what it meant to be a father. Epstein goes and takes pictures of his father's business as it collapses in Mount Holyoke, and what it means to go bankrupt. I mean, these are very powerful kinds of personal photographs that this earlier generation would not have done. So I remember.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tension between the artist's desire to push the boundaries of their art and developing technology. Perhaps they're complementary with each other. The earliest photographers, for instance, only took what we might call record pictures. They traveled to distant lands and they brought back images that people would want to see. But I think in the early, say, first half of the 20th century, photographers were more interested in using their craft to affect change. Lewis Hine, for instance, and Jacob Riis, they photographed children in slums, and the pictures were used as instruments to try and provoke social change. But I think the Photo League is a very important time in the history of photography because it provided, at least the photographers in New York, with not only a place to learn the craft of photography, but it provided a forum. The photographers from the Photo League in their writings, they talk about how they would get together and just talk about photography and talk about social issues and talk about anything. So it became a time to develop, and they did produce what they called several documents on the streets: the Harlem document, the Pitt Street document, and there
Chelsea
were
document.
and 4, I believe, and they worked as groups on these particular images. But then I think in the 1970s, there was actually a formative but brief period when the camera became the photographer's therapist. Okay, they literally there was a group of photographers, Christian Sund, Leonard Freed, who really brought the cameras into their family lives. Particularly Christian Sund, who has these photographs of his kids in the backseat of the car looking bored out of their minds, or peeking into his teenage daughter's room when she's kissing a boyfriend. And I think it's understandable that this was short-lived because the photographers would come home, and if they didn't have a camera in their hands, they would pick one up. And so imagine you and your wife having a discussion and you have a camera and you're clicking away while she's talking to you. Leonard Freed received a Guggenheim to travel around the country with his girlfriend and document the emotional states that the couple went through in this sort of forced enclosure. And the photographs of his girlfriend really looked like different women, depending on whether they're happy or whether they've encountered some kind of interpersonal difficulty. So I think the art just rolls along, and in the same way that painting experienced the development of modern art, which drastically changed what came before it, artists are always kind of trying something new. And I think the people that I touched on, they wanted to use the camera not as a confessional, but as a instrument to learn more about themselves.
I think we can take one more question.
With that in mind, how would you explain Vivian Maier, and how exceptional was she? She didn't share it with the world. It was shared after her death.
Yeah, obviously, she was, there's this new biography of her out, as it were, which I have not yet read. So all I've done is read a review that suggested that she pursued her photography in part as a way of exploring herself and her particular world, that she was not interested in in exhibits or in publication or the other means by which photography communicates, right? I think that not everybody who obviously takes photographs is interested in the communicative part. She took lots of photographs of herself, right? Really wonderful self-portraits. So that exploration of self is obviously part of what she's doing, yeah.
I think also something Irving Goffman touched on in a talk that I heard. Pointing a camera at someone, he says, is an act of confrontation. And I think with Vivian Maier, in part, this is relevant in that she was, from what I've been able to read, she was a very shy person, very withdrawn. She took jobs where she was kind of on the fringe of society and she just earned enough money to do whatever she wanted to do. And so I think the camera, in a sense, liberated her to become another personality. And she was really quite a good photographer in terms of compositional and lighting issues. And if she, I think she stayed in the background because she was, I don't know how, but devoid of ambition. I mean, she must have known she was good on a certain level, but she just didn't put herself out there to be judged. And I think had she, her name certainly would be among the people we'd be talking about today. In spite of the fact that she's not Jewish.
Right.
So unfortunately, we have to bring our proceedings to a close here. But on behalf of Steve Ross and the Kasdan Institute, first of all, I want to thank our two speakers, Deborah Dashmore and Bill Aaron, for giving us so much to think about. I also want to thank the USC Visual Studies Research Institute for partnering with the Kasdan Institute and bringing tonight's speakers. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for coming, and I hope you will continue to come to Kasdan events. And I wish everybody a good evening.
Okay. I would like a copy of what you wrote, if you wouldn't mind. Yeah.